Your camera should make your job easier, not harder. But what happens when you're in a dimly lit reception trying to capture the first dance? In your autofocus hunts, your ISO is maxed out, and you miss a shot that can't be recreated. In wedding photography, you don't get do-overs. That's why having a camera that performs flawlessly in any lighting condition, tracks fast-moving subjects with ease, and keeps up with long wedding days is a game changer. I've spent the last year shooting just over 30 weddings with the Nikon Z8. Putting you through every challenge possible: bright midday sun, candlelit receptions, fast-paced dance floors, and long 10-hour days. In today's video, I'm breaking down why I think the Nikon Z8 is the best mirrorless camera for wedding photography in 2025. Its strengths, its limitations, and whether it's worth the investment for professional photographers just like you. So let's dive in. Specs only tell half the story. What matters is how the Z8 performs on an actual wedding day. So let's break down what makes this camera a game changer. The Nikon Z8 has a 45.7 megapixel stacked CMOS sensor. It's got the same high resolution as the Z9 for stunning image quality. It's got the same X-Speed 7 processor, which means it's got ultra fast processing for better noise handling and dynamic range. It's able to shoot up to 20 frames per second with RAW photos, 30 frames per second with JPEG, and 120 frames per second in 11 megapixel JPEG. This gives you insanely fast burst speeds for never missing a moment. It also has a 493-point autofocus system with subject detecting autofocus, making it great for wedding photography. It's got an ISO range from 64 to 25,600, which, although I'll never crank it up that high, makes me feel comfortable knowing that I have that range to play with. It's got a 4-axis tilting LCD screen, which is the first of its kind that I've seen in a Nikon camera, which allows you to create some really cool compositions by being able to tilt your screen in this way. It's got an electronic shutter with 0 rolling shutter issues. It's got a weather-sealed magnesium alloy body, and its dual card slots either take one CF or XQD card and one SD card. And at the end of the day, it weighs in at just about 2 pounds. Now, the big selling point with the Nikon Z8 is that it has a lot of the similar internals that the Nikon Z9 has, except in a much more manageable size and weight. The Z8 is essentially a mini Z9 without the built-in vertical grip, making it much more manageable for wedding photographers working long hours. In comparison to its flagship predecessor, it has no mechanical shutter. With its fully electronic shutter, it eliminates shutter wear, but it does require the awareness that in some artificial lighting, you could get flickering and banding in your photos. And unlike the Z9, the Z8 doesn't have built-in GPS tagging, which in the world of wedding photography is somewhat of a useless tool, as we're not really geotagging the locations that we're shooting at because we know where we are. It's not like when you're shooting wildlife and you're on a trail and you want to know exactly where you photograph a type of bird. We know what venues we're going to be at. We know where we photograph the photos, so this is kind of irrelevant for a wedding photographer. And another thing that's different with the Z8 in comparison to the Z9 is the price point. You're basically able to get all of the same internals and great image quality at a fraction of the price. So if you don't need the absolute tank-like build of the Z9, this is the perfect camera for you. And although I do own a Z9 and that is my main camera body on the wedding day, if I could go back in time, I'd wait until they released the Z8s and I would have bought 2 of those for my main camera bodies. And the reason why I would do that is because after a 10-hour wedding day, when I go to grab my Z8, it feels like I'm picking up my phone to shoot photos because of the weight difference in the 2 cameras. So it's much lighter, but it keeps a lot of the features of the Z9 that I love. It still has the 3D tracking autofocus mode, which means once I lock onto a subject, it doesn't let go, even in dim reception lighting. And the fact that it has starlight mode, which is really made for astrophotography, allows for you to detect your subjects in ultra dark environments, which is a lifesaver for super dark venues. I also love that this camera is super silent. Although the Z9's firmware was updated with this feature, having the ability to change the shutter sounds and the volume of the shutter sounds is a game changer. With this camera, I can lower my shutter sounds so that I can hear that I'm taking the photo, but maybe somebody 2 to 3 feet from me can't hear that my camera's clicking every time that I take a photo. So during ceremonies, you're able to really go through unnoticed and you're not disturbing everyone as you're taking photos. And the burst speeds on this camera are amazing. With how fast-paced weddings can be, you're never in a place where the buffer fills up and you're losing an opportunity to catch moments. With this camera shooting raw photos at 20 frames per second, you ensure that no moment slips through the crack. The Z8 sounds impressive, but how does it stand up to its Sony and Canon competitors? Well, when it comes to those cameras, they don't have a stacked sensor. This camera is going to outperform them when it comes to rolling shutters. It's going to allow for the camera to have a faster readout, and it's going to have better noise handling. Whenever I'm looking at reception photos from my second shooter and I compare them to mine, I can tell the difference between noise at 3200 ISO with a Canon R5 in comparison to my Nikon Z8. I feel like out of all the camera manufacturers, the Nikon systems tend to handle higher ISO better, So having that stack sensor in this camera is already setting it miles ahead of its competitors. And I know that it's always been a joke in the industry that Nikon has the worst autofocus, but ever since the introduction of the Z line cameras, they've really taken a large step each and every year to improve the autofocus to the point where I think it's the best autofocus system in the game right now. Especially when it comes to low light, the Nikon Z8 vastly outperforms the Sony and the Canon. And where the Nikon Z8 is going to differ from these other cameras is that this camera is kind of built like a tank. When you feel this thing, you don't feel like you're picking up a Canon R5 or one of the Sony cameras. The Canon R5 has a really plasticky feel. And whenever I see my second shooters working with it, I always feel like I'm waiting for them to drop it and the thing's going to shatter into a million pieces. So when you're buying a Nikon camera, you're not only buying a camera that's going to take good pictures, you have a camera that you know that if there's any incident where your camera falls, which I had with the Nikon Z8 this year, we were riding on a golf cart up to a lighthouse to take photos and it wasn't completely locked into my belt system. And when I went to go get off the golf cart, my leg kind of pushed it out of the clip and it fell right onto concrete. And I picked it up, worked fine. It's worked fine since, and I haven't had any issues. So I know that this camera is built to last and I can speak from experience on that. Wedding days are chaos. You don't have time to fight with your camera. So how does the Z8 actually perform when it counts? So when it comes to an actual wedding day, the Nikon Z8 for me is my second body. But like I said earlier, if I had the choice, both my main and my second camera would be Nikon Z8s. But because I bought the Z9 the year before the Z8 came out, I haven't wanted to go through the process of selling the Z9, losing money, and having to buy the Z8. So I'm going to stay with this setup for the foreseeable future until newer bodies get released and maybe we see a Z8 II in the next few years. But with the Nikon Z9 being my main body and the Z8 being my second body, it doesn't get as much use as I would love to put it through, but it definitely does get its fair share of use throughout the day. So I'm usually using it throughout the majority of the day paired with a 28mm. Usually during the getting ready portion of the day, I'm swapping out my 28mm for my 105. This allows me to be able to get all of my detail shots while I still have my 50mm 1.2 on my main camera. So sometimes I'll throw the 50mm on the Z8 just to have a lighter setup, run outside, grab some photos, come back in, and reassess how I'm going to set up all of my gear. Now during the ceremony, this camera specifically has my 70-200 on it. My main body will continue to have the 50mm, and during the ceremony, my Z8 is usually the camera that's capturing all of my telephoto images. If it were my main body though, I would have my 50mm on it and I would be using it just like I would be using my Z9. So although during this breakdown, I'm explaining how I use it and how it can practically be used, realize that all the main body functions that I'm using my Z9 for, I could easily use this camera for, and I might actually have to do that this weekend as my Z9 is still in for repair right now. And then when it comes to reception, this camera has the 28mm on it and I'm using it to capture tons of action shots on the dance floor. I like to usually use my second body for some shutter drag photos, so this camera I know is always going to handle great with autofocus. Sometimes, as it is with any reception, I might even just put it on manual focus modes and shoot at like an f8 on the dance floor so I don't even have to worry about autofocus at all. But this thing handles amazingly in low light and I never have any worry really of if I'm going to get the shot, which is something I used to have a lot when I was shooting with DSLRs, and you really don't have that real-time feedback of how the autofocus is actually working. And my verdict for this camera is that it's reliable, fast, and has yet to let me down in the most demanding environments. A camera is only as good as the glass that you pair it with. So if you're investing in the Z8, here are my must-have accessories and lenses to maximize its full potential. Some go-to lenses that I think you should always have in your kit, regardless of if you use it with the Z8 or not, are a 50mm lens and something around the 28-35mm range. I love the 28-35mm range because you're able to get a photo that's just wide enough to set the scene without feeling like your subjects are lost in the environment. My other go-to lens, which is probably the only time you're going to hear me recommend a zoom lens, is the 70-200. This is the perfect lens for capturing the ceremony and the reception from a distance without feeling like you're right on top of people. I feel like this lens really allows you to be able to capture the moments where maybe mom is crying during first dance or maybe dad's crying during the ceremony. You're able to capture this photo tight up from a good distance and not pull them out of the moment with them realizing that they're being photographed. Another lens that is a must-have is the Nikon 105 macro. This is a great lens for capturing all of the detail shots like the rings, the florals, and all sorts of stuff from a very close-up aspect. So make sure you have this macro lens or any type of macro lens to go along with your Z8. When it comes to lighting accessories, I use Godox triggers with off-camera flash. Sometimes I'll put a V1 on my camera, but you want to make sure that you get a trigger and get a great understanding of off-camera flash and how to work with it. When it comes to the Z8 and its card storage, two 128GB cards, but remember for me, the Nikon Z8 is a secondary body. If it was my main body, I'd probably go through four 128GB SD cards like I do with my Z9. But the thing that's great about the Z8 in comparison to the Z9 is that you're able to shoot one SD card and one CF Express card. And if you know anything about the price point on the CF Express cards, to have to buy two CF Express cards, which means you're spending a crazy amount of money on storage in comparison to the price point on SD cards, which are much lower than CF Express. And the last accessory that you're going to want to have when it comes to the Z8 are some extra batteries. I always like to have 4 to 6 batteries for each type of camera that I have in the case that they have different batteries. So my Nikon Z9, I usually like to have 4 to 6 batteries, and my Nikon Z8, I like to have 4 to 6 extra batteries because you never know if a battery is just going to randomly fail on a wedding day and lose its juice. You have enough backups to last you throughout the day, and you're not trying to find a wall plug to charge your batteries in the middle of a chaotic wedding day. Now let's break down the pros and cons of the Nikon Z8. The first pro is that it has incredible autofocus. It locks onto subjects quickly and tracks them effortlessly, even in dim lighting. It has amazing low light performance. It handles high ISOs beautifully without excessive noise, making it perfect for receptions and indoor ceremonies. It's got a stack sensor, eliminating rolling shutter, and allows for super fast readout speeds. It's got all the flagship features of the Z9 in a lighter body, which gives you a powerhouse camera in a much more manageable size. And finally, it allows for silent shooting, giving you the ability to manage the shutter sounds and their volume. And as with most of my videos, I spend the majority of the video talking about all the great things of the camera. Let's talk about some of the things that are drawbacks to this camera, especially in comparison to the Nikon Z9. The first thing is that the battery life is good, but it's not great. For someone who's used to having large battery capacity with my Nikon Z9 and only really having to change batteries out once a day during a wedding, the Nikon Z8 has the standard EL15 battery that you can find in the Nikon Z7 II and Nikon Z6 III. So with this camera, having extra batteries is a must because you'll be running out of battery quite often throughout the day. And another con is that although it's not as heavy as its Z9 counterpart, it's still a pretty heavy camera. When being compared to like the Nikon Z6 or the Z7, this camera still feels like you're carrying around a Nikon D850. And although the weight comparison at this size isn't too big, if weight to you matters, then this might be a camera that is just a little too heavy for you. Another con with the Nikon Z8 is that although it's not as expensive as the Nikon Z9, it still can come in at about $1,500 to $2,000 more expensive than the Nikon Z6 and Z7 counterparts. What better way to prove this camera's capabilities than showing you actual wedding photos that I've taken with it? Here are some of my favorite images shot with the Nikon Z8. After a full year of wedding photography with the Nikon Z8, I can confidently say it's one of the best mirrorless cameras I've ever used. But here's the thing, having the right camera is only part of the equation. Knowing how to maximize it and building a workflow that makes your wedding days easier is just as important. So if you want any more information on this camera or anything wedding photography related, make sure to sign up for my newsletter in the description below. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. All these things help me grow what I'm trying to do here at the channel. So until the next video, guys, I will see you later.